All right. Today I want to talk about college athletes because there's a really disturbing trend going on right now in the college sports world. Many of us are aware of the huge physical sacrifices that athletes make when they play college sports. In particular, the concussion problem in college football has been really well documented lately. So we're generally aware of the physical detriments that athletes take the risk of putting their bodies through when they play college sports. Additionally, the mental health sacrifices that athletes can make when they play college sports has been made light of recently. Athletes are more likely to experience depression than the general student population. So these are all risks, sacrifices, problems that athletes face when they play college sports. But I want to focus today on something that I find even more alarming, which is that when athletes do have these physical injuries or issues, or do have these mental health issues, most of them don't report them. They don't seek help when they need it. According to a survey done by the Michigan Daily, 63% of athletes say that mental health problems has affected their performance in the last 4 weeks. 63%, but only 6% of athletes say that they've actually talked to someone about these issues, whether it's a coach or a professional. And we see the same thing with physical injuries. According to a study done by the Boston University CTE Center, only 4% of potential concussions are ever actually reported. 4%. And that's with concussions. We see the same thing with other injuries, ankle injuries, knee injuries, whatever. Athletes, again, we see them brush aside their own best interests and try to play through it and not get help when they should. So with all these monumental sacrifices and with so much at stake, the question I want to focus on today is why we see this behavior from athletes. Why do we see athletes consistently put aside their own best interests and not report their issues? Why do they seem so hell-bent on making it in college sports? When an athlete receives a blow to the head or gets his bell rung, what makes him want to stay in the game for that next play when his brain is at risk? Or when an athlete is going through the depths of a deep depression, what makes her want to keep on showing up every day to practice and keep on throwing her body into practice and putting herself through that instead of trying to address the problem and get help? Now, certainly some of this comes from within the athletes themselves, right? Their own drive and determination to succeed. But a lot of it comes from us, the huge expectations that we place on athletes as a society. Athletes are constantly pursuing the quintessential image or ideal of the athlete that we've all created for them, right? Because as coaches and as fans, we hold out a certain image that we want our athletes to fulfill. We want them to be heroes, indestructible, tough guys, super women, no excuses, win at all costs, savages. That's what we like. That's what we like as the consumer of college sports. But this is an impossible image to fulfill all the time. It's inhuman and it's unrealistic. But athletes will try to fulfill that image because that is what's expected of them by our society. That's what our sports culture demands of them. Now, what they really are is human, of course, but we seem to forget that sometimes. We dehumanize athletes in ways that I'll explain later on. But before I get to that, let me explain how I know that this kind of obsessive sports culture is contributing to the problem of athletes not reporting their issues. It's because I was an athlete here at the University of Michigan. I was a walk-on player for the basketball team for 2 years. And I know I don't look like it, but it's true. That is really me. I did not Photoshop myself into that picture. That's all 5'7" of me playing in a game against Rutgers my freshman year. So the story is, when I came here as a freshman, I was guilty of perpetuating this kind of obsessive sports culture myself. I put it on a pedestal just like everyone else does. And this idea of what college athletics was is part of what made me want to become a student manager for the men's basketball team my freshman year. I wanted to be I wanted to be a part of it. I wanted to be in that world. And when I did become a manager, my romantic notions of what it would be like, what it would mean to be a Division I athlete here at the University of Michigan, drove me to work really hard to try to walk onto the team. All right, I wanted to live the dream, run out of the tunnel, experience all the social benefits and the glory that I thought Division I athletes always get to enjoy. So I worked really hard as a manager to try to walk on. And I actually eventually succeeded. There were some injuries on the team my freshman year, and they were shorthanded in practice, so they called me up to become a practice player for the team. But as the season went on, my experiences really did not match up with my expectations at all. Suddenly, instead of being on the outside and kind of feeding into the sports culture and, as a fan, putting my own demands and expectations on the athlete, suddenly I was the athlete. And even though I was just a practice player, I was on the receiving end of these demands and expectations from coaches, friends, family, not intentionally on their part, but I did feel it, even as just a practice player. Coaches were really tough on me because I was very disposable and unimportant to the team actually winning games just as a practice player. But my friends started treating me differently. It was weird. They started calling me, a hero and such an underdog story, and that I proved that dreams really do come true. So it was a lot of attention, but I sort of dragged my way through the season. I wasn't playing very well. I wasn't a part of that brotherhood in the locker room that I hoped I would be because of my status, as a walk-on manager, practice player, whatever. It was hard to penetrate that social circle of the actual players on the team. So it was actually kind of an anxious, lonely experience for me. So I didn't feel like a hero at all, because I wasn't one. But nonetheless, I did get to dress for that last home game of the year against Rutgers. I did get to run out of the tunnel and all of that and experience that. I got to taste that small glory part of it that the fans see. And I even got into the game for a whole 55.2 seconds. We were up by a lot at the end of the game, so I got in. I actually got fouled with 6 seconds left. And I shot a 1-and-1, and I missed the front end of my 1-and-1 free throw. So that was kind of my one chance. I missed the free throw. I never got in a game again. But despite that kind of anxious, lonely experience my freshman year, I stuck with it for my sophomore year, and I stayed a practice player for my sophomore year because there had to be more, right? There had to be more to the dream to being a Division I athlete at Michigan. So I stayed with it my sophomore year, but it was really much of the same. The same lonely, anxious feelings began to take over, and by the end of my sophomore year, I really kind of hated basketball. It had become more of a job to me than a passion of mine, and mentally, I wasn't in a good place at all. So after my sophomore year, the summer after my sophomore year, just this past summer actually, I took a step back and decided to move on from the team. So I had this dream of becoming a Division I basketball player, and I actually succeeded in becoming a Division I basketball player, but the reality of being a D1 athlete really did not match up with my own fantasies that I had conjured up in my own head. And I tell that story for the purposes of this talk because my experience with the Michigan basketball team really changed the way that I view Division I athletics as a whole. I got to see the realities of being a Division I athlete from the inside, and I feel like I can now understand Division I athletics for what it really is, not what everyone hypes it up to be, and not even from what I hyped it up to be. I got to see how athletes are treated both inside the facility and outside the facility, and I got to kind of understand all the demands, expectations, and images thrown at athletes that they're supposed to fulfill, and how much all of this truly affects them. So let's start with coaches and how they can treat athletes. For Division I coaches, everything hinges on winning games. Their employment, their income, their reputation, all of this is dependent on winning. And the athletes that they recruit are the vehicles to those victories. Now, Let me preface this by saying that I think most coaches are good and decent people who care about the well-being of their athletes. That's part of the reason why they got hired by the athletic departments in the first place. But with so much at stake for them personally, it's easy to see how they can come to view their athletes as cogs, as assets that they can deploy and try to use to win games. And I liken it to how a chess player views his pieces on a chessboard, kind of as pawns that they can move and control on their own quest to victory. So the athlete can feel like this sometimes, and this can be dehumanizing to them. And it's because of this attitude that sometimes we see coaches put their own self-interest ahead of the players. Scott DeMars is a former USC football player, and in a recent interview, he recalls back to his playing days when his coach every week would read off the list of kids who had skipped class that week. And he would single out and put down the kids who were not on that list because he wanted them to prioritize football, even if that meant taking away from academics, presumably so that they could have a better chance at winning more games. Similarly, I recently went to a panel discussion by the Fab Five, which is a great Michigan basketball team from the early 90s. And they said on the very first day, the first thing that their coach said to them when they got to campus, he huddled them up and he said, "I know what I told your parents, but you guys are here to do one thing and one thing only, and that's to play basketball." Now, only 2% of college athletes go on to play professionally, so clearly this order of priorities in prioritizing their sport above their academics is not what's in the best interest of the player. But coaches project their own image of what they want their players to be. Tough guys who will do anything to win games and sacrifice their academics and sacrifice 32 hours a week to help the team win. And players normally accept these sometimes irrationally high demands because you have to fulfill your coach's expectations if you want to play, right? You have to please your coach if you want to play. And I think that this is part of the reason that athletes don't report their injuries because they're afraid of disappointing or not living up to the image that their coach has for them. My sophomore year, in a practice right around the time of the NCAA tournament, I went up for a rebound and I came down and I sprained my ankle pretty badly. And I was on the ground in pain. I know I'd hurt myself pretty bad. And I heard one of the coaches start yelling at me to get up, get up, Johnny. He was like, "Get up, Johnny, get up, come on, get up." And I knew that I was hurt pretty badly, but I heard him and I tried to tough it out and play through it because I was afraid of disappointing his own image of me as a tough kid, walk-on, practice player who's supposed to be in there every day helping practice, even though that wasn't what was in my best interest. So the next day, I took a few Advil, even though I could barely walk, and I tried to play in practice. And within the first 20 minutes of practice, my ankle just gave out, and I ended up spraining it way worse than I had initially. But when I hurt myself the first time, my coach was screaming at me to get up. He didn't have my best interest in mind. He was acting on his own projection of me and what I was supposed to be as a practice player, and he was telling me to get up. And I ended up hurting myself because I didn't want to disappoint him. So as much as coaches can sometimes not have the best interest of the players in mind and dehumanize them in the facility, when players leave the facility and go out to campus, the peers treat them in the opposite way, right? Students worship the athletes. Students treat athletes differently than they treat everybody else. They treat them like celebrities. I always found it strange when I was a manager or a practice player and someone would come up to me and ask me if I hang out with the players. And when I'd say, yeah, kind of, they'd get all giddy. But no one ever asked the players if they hang out with the managers, right? That would be ridiculous. But this always bothered me. Associating with athletes is viewed as a higher social privilege than associating with managers or with anyone else. And this always angered me because I knew from being in the locker room every day that we all have something to offer, not just the athletes. On the first day of class this year, in one of my classes, a football player walked in on the first day, and like whispers break out all over the room, and the kid next to me turned to me and whispered to me, he was like, is he really on the football team? As if we'd just been graced by the presence of some royalty. So it's this kind of rhetoric that only furthers the celebrity culture in college athletics, and it's a celebrity culture that really isn't good for anyone. It makes the non-athletes feel inferior, and it reinforces and gives athletes the false message that they actually are superior to the rest of the student body. But it also puts pressure on the athlete to live up to this kind of celebrity, big man on campus status. And I think that this is one of the reasons that athletes don't report their mental health issues, is because they're afraid of not being able to live up to what everyone else thinks of them as a celebrity, as a stud, as a tough guy, big man on campus. I'll refer back to former USC football player Scott DeMars when he said, when you're playing, you're carrying everyone else's dreams with you. Now, that is a big burden to bear, and athletes do feel that burden. And when they can't live up to these images or these dreams that their peers or other people project onto them, it's a really distinct, lonely, shameful, kind of embarrassing feeling that can set in. When I stepped up to the line at Chrysler Arena to shoot my free throw, I knew that everyone wanted me to be that underdog story. Maybe they could relate to me because I'm just 5'7" like everyone else, and they wanted me to be that underdog story, that dreamer who actually made it big in Big Ten basketball. But when I missed my free throw and I couldn't be that guy for everyone else, I had the displeasure of experiencing this distinct, lonely, shameful feeling, and it affected me. So we treat our athletes, we project our dreams onto our athletes, and we treat our athletes like royalty. We treat opposing athletes like animals, and no one seems to question it. Opposing athletes, when they go on the road, they're the targets of personal verbal attacks that aren't accepted anywhere else in society. So, at Michigan football games, for example, this is what happens every time the Michigan defense forces a fourth down. Everyone will move their hands back and forth in the student section. Everyone points their arms back and forth at the quarterback, who's just failed and is walking back to the sideline, and they chant, "You suck, you suck," at the quarterback, "You suck, you suck, you suck," and the chant crescendos in a final, "You suck, bitch." Thousands of smart kids on a campus that denounces sexist language all point their arms at the quarterback, tell him that he sucks, and then call him a bitch. Thousands of kids. Now, isn't this wrong? No, says our sports culture. It's not, because it's a sports game and the standards are different. Now, there has been some debate about getting rid of the "You Suck" chant in the past, but the whole discourse around this debate centers on whether the chant is creative enough. Some people think it's not witty enough, it's too simple, just, "You suck." There's not even a conversation, though, about the glaringly questionable ethics of thousands of people pointing at one person and calling him a bitch. You wouldn't go to someone who's just failed a job interview or bombed a job interview and run up to them on the street and say, "Hey, you suck, bitch." But that would be ridiculous. But that's what we do in our sports culture. And we do it with thousands of people at once. But another thing that I hear at Michigan football games, when the opposing team's running back will get the ball, I'll hear someone a few rows behind me yell something like, "F him up," or "Kill that mother," And to me, this is an incredibly poor taste in itself, but especially because of all the research that's been coming out on CTE and concussions, because athletes have died from CTE that they develop from sustaining these big hits in football games. So that jarring hit that that fan is cheering for could actually kill him, or contribute to something that one day kills him. But all of this fan behavior is not only accepted in our sports culture, it's actually encouraged. We view opposing athletes as targets for our own kind of fan catharsis. And to me, this is a little bit low and lazy, but we do it. And we forget that there are people underneath those uniforms. So we've gone too far with our obsessive sports culture. Okay, coaches, students, and fans are all partly responsible for feeding and creating this obsessive sports culture that the athlete is forced to operate in. And this system caters to what the coaches want, what the students want, and what the fans want. But no one in the system is truly looking out for the athlete. Not even the athletes are looking out for themselves, as we saw in the statistics at the beginning of this talk. Our expectations of what we want athletes to be, what these three groups want athletes to be, those expectations are so high that athletes are hurting themselves just to try to fulfill them. So we need to change, and this needs to change. One of the things that I think might help is if athletes unionize, and that's in the works, especially at Northwestern, with their football team. I also think the NCAA should lower their hours limit, because right now the average athlete spends 32 hours per week devoted to their sport, which is too much to ask. But what can we do as a community? What can we do as coaches, fans, and students? I think the biggest thing is just that we stop demanding that athletes fulfill our own image of what we want them to be. All right? They're not a service for us. We need to start treating athletes like people first instead of like athletes. Right? We need to start treating them like human beings first instead of seeing them and treating them like athletes. We dehumanize athletes and we're quick to idolize them, but we need to start caring for them as individuals like we would with any other human being. So, athletes, we need to bridge, maybe if we lowered our demands, if we lowered our demands of athletes, maybe athletes would lower the demands of themselves and feel free to be more human, to be imperfect. Maybe if there wasn't so much pressure, athletes would be more likely to report a concussion or a sprained ankle or to seek psychological help when needed. Maybe if the time demands weren't so high, athletes would feel more empowered to pursue their academic passions and get themselves on the right career path. Maybe without constant reinforcement that they're above or superior to the rest of the student body, we could bridge the social divide between non-athletes and athletes, and they could engage more with each other. We can support our athletes and protect their well-being and their best interests while still enjoying everything that we love about college sports. The intense competition, its powerful ability to bring us together as a community. But we need to temper the hysteria before more athletes are harmed. Thank you.